Claire Bennett thought the man in the gray work shirt had just destroyed a $50 million design, but 10 minutes later, the same room would understand he was the only reason it still existed. The glass design lab at Bennett Aeroworks was not a place where people wandered by accident. Every door required a badge. Every workstation was assigned. Every file on the central screen carried approval layers, engineering notes, compliance checks, and names that mattered more than most voices in the building. At 7:42 on a Thursday morning, the main display showed the turbine cooling module that Claire had spent 6 months defending to investors, partners, and a board that believed patience was something other companies could afford. The module rotated slowly in blue and silver lines above the conference table, clean, precise, and worth more than the neighborhood Ethan Walker lived in by a number too large to feel real. Ethan stood in front of it with a maintenance cart behind him, a gray work shirt tucked into faded work pants, one sleeve pushed up because the lab air filter above workstation 3 had jammed halfway out of its frame. On the screen, a correction layer was open. A thin orange line crossed the model at an angle no one from the executive team had approved. A scrap of paper sat beside the keyboard with a pencil sketch drawn in small, careful strokes. That was what Claire saw when the lab doors slid open and she stepped inside with a silver tablet in one hand and Mason Reed half a step behind her. Her face changed before she spoke. Not into panic. Claire Bennett did not panic in front of employees. It changed into something colder, the expression of a woman watching the future of her company being touched by someone she had already decided did not belong near it. "Step away from that station," she said. Ethan turned slowly. He did not reach for the keyboard. He did not try to hide the paper. He simply stepped back once, hands visible, eyes steady. Mason Reed moved faster than everyone else in the room. He was already at Claire's shoulder, already looking at the screen, already understanding how to make the moment point away from him. "That file was locked last night," Mason said. "He has no authorization to be in the design layer." Behind the glass wall, in the corridor outside the lab, Lily Walker stood with a small sketchbook pressed against her chest and a blue pencil tucked behind her ear. She was 6 years old, quiet in the way children become quiet when adults forget they are watching. Ethan had brought her because the school's early care program had opened late after a waterline issue, and his shift was supposed to end before the executive team arrived. She had been drawing airplane wings on the hallway bench while he finished the filter replacement. Now she stood still, looking through the glass at her father surrounded by people in pressed shirts and polished shoes. Claire set the tablet on the table with a sound sharp enough to make 2 junior engineers look up from the far workstation. "Do you understand what this is?" she asked. Ethan looked at the screen, then at Claire. "Yes, ma'am." That answer made Mason's jaw tighten. It made Claire angrier because it was calm. "This design goes in front of Northbridge Aerospace in less than an hour. It is tied to a $50 million contract. It has been reviewed by senior engineers, compliance consultants, and external validators. And you thought it was acceptable to walk in here and alter it because you saw something you did not understand?" Ethan said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved once toward the corridor, where Lily's hand tightened around the sketchbook. Then he lowered his gaze back to the table. "I did not alter the base file," he said. "I added a correction layer and a note." Mason gave a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. A maintenance technician added a correction layer to a flight systems component. The sentence landed exactly where he meant it to land. Around the lab, people stopped moving. Nora Ellis, seated near the simulation console, looked at the model and then at Ethan's scrap paper. Something in her face shifted before she looked down. Claire did not notice. She was watching Ethan, and all she could see was the uniform, the open file, the timing, the risk. "This is reckless," she said, her voice low enough that it carried more weight than shouting. "This is unauthorized, unacceptable, and dangerous to everything this team has built." Ethan absorbed the words without flinching. He had learned years ago that defending yourself too early in the wrong room only gave people more surface to strike. He did not tell her who he used to be. He did not mention the designs he had saved before anyone knew they were failing. He did not explain the 14th cycle, the heat-load shift, or the small bend in the stress path that had stopped him cold in the empty lab the night before. He only stood there in his gray work shirt while his daughter watched from the other side of the glass, and the entire room mistook his silence for guilt. Ethan Walker was not a man who had drifted into that lab because he did not understand boundaries. He understood them too well. He understood locked doors, approval chains, polished rooms, and the kind of people who believed a badge title told the whole truth about a person before he opened his mouth. 7 years earlier, before the gray work shirt, before the night maintenance schedule, before the apartment with the thin walls and the kitchen table that doubled as Lily's homework desk, Ethan had been a structural systems designer at a mid-sized aerospace supplier outside Columbus. He was 27 then, younger than most of the senior engineers, quiet enough to be underestimated, and precise enough to make the people who depended on his work uncomfortable. He was not the man who gave the best presentations. He was the man whose numbers survived the second review. He understood how metal behaved after heat had lied to it for too long. He understood how vibration carried weakness from one bracket to the part beside it. He understood that most failures did not announce themselves with drama. They began as a small line moving where it should not move, a stress point warming half a degree faster than expected, a tiny delay between what the model promised and what the material could endure. Back then, his wife, Anna, used to say he listened to machines the way other people listened to music. She said it gently, usually when he stayed too long at the table. With sketches spread beside his dinner plate and Lily asleep in the next room. Anna died on a rainy Monday in November, not all at once in the way stories sometimes make grief sound clean, but after 6 weeks of hospital rooms, insurance forms, physical therapy plans that became impossible, and a little girl asking why the house had gone quiet. Ethan kept working after that because bills did not pause for loss, and because Lily needed routine more than he needed sleep. Then came the failure review at his old company. A prototype housing cracked during a stress demonstration in front of a client. The official report called it an unexpected material response. Ethan knew that was not true. He had flagged the load path 2 months earlier, written the note, attached the model, and sent the warning through the proper channel. Somewhere above him, the warning had become inconvenient. Somewhere between his desk and the final sign-off, the wording changed. When the crack appeared, the room needed a name lower than the people who had approved the schedule. Ethan's name was available. He did not shout in the meeting. He did not throw papers. He listened while men with cleaner shoes explained his own work back to him incorrectly, then packed his desk into a cardboard box that afternoon while Anna's photo lay face up on top of a stack of notebooks. After that, he stopped applying for design positions. Not because he had forgotten how to design, and not because he was ashamed of the work. He was tired of rooms where truth needed permission from the wrong people before it was allowed to matter. Bennett Aeroworks hired him 18 months later for night maintenance. The hours were ugly, but they let him take Lily to school, pick her up when early care failed, and keep dinner warm in the small apartment on Alder Street. He fixed air filters, replaced light panels, cleared jammed vents, tightened loose mounts, and noticed more than anyone asked him to notice. At home, he repaired a broken kitchen fan with the same patience he once brought to flight systems. Lily sat beside him with her sketchbook and blue pencil, drawing wings too large for the little planes beneath them. She did not know all the reasons her father worked nights. She only knew he came home tired, made pancakes on Saturdays, and never let broken things stay broken if he had the tools to make them right. That morning in the glass lab, with Claire Bennett's anger still hanging in the air and Mason Reed standing ready to turn him into a convenient mistake, Ethan kept his hands at his sides and his voice even. The people around him saw a maintenance technician who had crossed a line. They did not see the man who had spent half his life learning exactly where lines failed. Claire Bennett had built the morning around control. By 6:15, the executive conference room on the east side of Bennett Aeroworks was already lit, coffee already placed, chairs already aligned along the glass table with the precision of a company trying not to look nervous. Beyond the windows, the Columbus sky was pale and flat, the kind of winter morning that made every building look sharper than it was. On the far wall, a countdown clock marked the arrival of the Northbridge Aerospace delegation. 52 minutes. 51. 50. Claire watched it without letting her face show how much each minute cost. At 29, she had become CEO young enough for certain men to call her impressive in a tone that made the word smaller than it should have been. She had learned to answer with results. Under her, Bennett Aeroworks had moved from contract overflow work into serious component design, not yet among the giants, but no longer easy to ignore. The turbine cooling module was supposed to prove that. Northbridge Aerospace did not hand $50 million to companies because their CEO spoke well in meetings. They wanted reliability, repeatable performance, and a design that could survive thermal stress without excuses. Claire had promised them all three. For 6 months, she had defended the module through investor calls, board questions, supplier delays, and one quiet week in March when payroll had come closer to the edge than anyone outside the finance office ever knew. To the engineers, the module was a technical submission. To Claire, it was rent for the factory floor, insurance for 400 employees, leverage with lenders, credibility in a market that did not forgive small companies for acting small. That was why Mason Reed mattered. Mason had been hired 3 years earlier with a resume that looked exactly the way board members liked resumes to look. Senior design roles. Aerospace certifications. Patents with his name attached near the middle of the list. He spoke confidently, dressed carefully, and understood how to turn uncertainty into language that sounded managed. Claire trusted him because she needed to trust someone who could translate the engineering risk into decisions she could defend upstairs. That morning, Mason stood at the front of the conference room with a laser pointer in his hand, walking through the final demo sequence for the leadership team. Nora Ellis sat 2 chairs from the end, laptop open, hands folded too tightly for someone simply listening. She was 26, newly promoted into simulation analysis, and still young enough to believe that if a chart showed a warning, someone would want to know why. The main slide showed the cooling module in clean blue geometry, load paths traced in white, thermal behavior summarized in neat rows of numbers. Claire listened, asked 2 questions about cycle endurance, and watched Mason answer both without hesitation. We have validated the stress behavior through all required operating ranges, he said. The variance remains within acceptable tolerance. Nora looked at her screen when he said acceptable. Only for a second. Claire saw the movement but did not understand it yet. Outside the conference room, through 2 hallways and a restricted glass door, Ethan Walker was finishing what should have been the last task of his night shift. The air filter above workstation 3 had jammed in its frame because the aluminum track was slightly bent. He had seen the same kind of bend in 100 ordinary places. Office vents. Apartment fans. Old heater grills. Flight housings. Things failed according to their nature whether people respected them or not. He loosened the panel, eased the filter down, and turned to place it on the maintenance cart. That was when the central screen woke from sleep mode and resumed the simulation someone had left open. Ethan did not mean to look. He simply did. The module rotated once. A stress line shifted across the inner cooling channel, almost nothing, 2 degrees at most, a small orange bend inside a field of blue. Ethan stopped with one hand still on the filter. In the executive room, Mason was telling Claire the design was ready. In the lab, Ethan was looking at the part of the future that was not. The line should not have moved. That was the first thing Ethan understood, before he thought about titles, contracts, badges, or consequences. On the central screen, the turbine cooling module rotated through its thermal cycle in a quiet blue glow, elegant enough to make the room believe in it. The outer housing held. The primary channel held. The airflow model looked clean at first glance, and first glance was where expensive mistakes like to hide. Ethan stepped closer without touching the workstation. The maintenance cart remained behind him with the old filter angled across the top shelf, a gray rectangle of dust and aluminum that no one in the executive conference room would ever know had brought him to that exact place at that exact minute. The simulation advanced from cycle 11 to cycle 12. The stress path across the inner cooling channel shifted again. Not much. A slight bend along the load transfer point, small enough for a busy engineer to call it noise, small enough for a report to bury under acceptable variance, small enough to survive a meeting if no one in the room had learned to distrust small things. Ethan had learned. He looked at the lower temperature spread, then at the expansion behavior along the bracket interface. His hand stopped halfway to the cart. By cycle 13, the orange line pulsed once, then settled. That was worse. A clean failure would have been obvious. This one behaved politely until it did not have to. He picked up the scrap of paper beside the keyboard, turned it over to the blank side, and used the short pencil from his pocket to draw the channel angle by hand. One line for the current load path. One line for where the heat would push it after repeated expansion. 1. Small mark where the support web should have carried force and did not. He did not need the full report to know what he was seeing. He had seen this kind of failure before in different clothes, a bracket, a housing, a fan mount, a prototype frame. Materials did not care whether the meeting was important. Heat did not care about investors. Stress did not respect a deadline because a company needed it to. The screen advanced. Cycle 14 began. The bend sharpened. Ethan stood completely still. In the glass reflection, he could see the empty lab behind him, the polished table, the model turbine under its clear case, the corridor beyond the door where Lily's little sketchbook rested on the bench beside her blue pencil. She was still outside, waiting for him to finish a job that should already have been done. He thought of breakfast at the apartment, 2 slices of toast, 1 banana split between them, Lily asking whether airplanes got tired if they stayed in the sky too long. He had told her everything needed rest if people wanted it to keep working. Now he looked at the model and understood that no one had given this design the rest of a proper question. The warning did not flash. No alarm sounded. The module did not explode across the screen or collapse in a way that would make even a careless room pay attention. It simply turned red at a point where the official version had promised blue. Ethan leaned closer, reading the numbers without moving the mouse. The failure point was not random. It was repeatable. The load path was carrying heat into the wrong support angle, and after enough thermal cycling, the stress would collect where the model had been told to pretend it spread evenly. He looked toward the locked glass door, then back at the screen. The demo was less than an hour away. A $50 million contract was built around a part that could not survive the 14th cycle without lying to everyone watching. Ethan set the scrap paper down and finally touched the workstation, not to change the file, not yet, but to open the layer panel and see whether anyone else had noticed. There was a comment trail folded under the simulation notes. One entry caught his eye because it had been resolved without being answered. Flagged for review by Nora Ellis. Thermal drift near cycle 14. Ethan read it twice. Then he looked at the final status beside it. Closed. Acceptable variance. He did not know who had closed it. He only knew the warning had been seen, named, and made quiet. The room was silent around him, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a place full of people who had already decided not to hear what the design was trying to say. The warning had not disappeared by accident. Ethan knew that before he found the second entry, because systems did not clean themselves that neatly without a hand guiding the broom. He stood in the empty lab with the old filter still on his maintenance cart and opened only what the workstation already allowed, moving carefully through the simulation notes, the same way a man might walk across a frozen pond by listening for the smallest sound beneath his feet. The first entry was Nora Ellis's. Thermal drift near cycle 14. Flagged for review. The second entry was Mason Reed's. Acceptable variance. No design change required. The third was not a warning at all, just a revision note with language polished smooth enough to pass through a meeting without catching on anything sharp. Ethan read it once, then again, and felt the old familiar weight settle in his chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. He had seen people do this before. Not always because they were evil. Sometimes because the schedule was tight. Sometimes because investors were waiting. Sometimes because the person who noticed the crack was too junior, too quiet, too inconvenient, or too easy to overrule. A warning did not have to be erased to be buried. It only had to be renamed. 20 minutes earlier, Nora had been in the executive conference room with her laptop open and her hands folded tightly under the table. She had watched Mason present the final readiness report while Claire Bennett listened with the focused calm of someone carrying too many jobs at once. When Mason reached the thermal endurance slide, Nora's eyes moved to the phrase she had not written but had been told to accept. Variance within expected range. She remembered the night she flagged the drift. It had been 11:38, the lab mostly empty, the module running its extended simulation while the cleaning crew moved down the hallway. She had watched cycle 14 turn faintly red along the inner channel, not full failure, not enough to bring the room running, but enough to make her sit forward. She had sent Mason a note before midnight. By morning, he had replied from his office with a single line. Good catch, but not material. Adjust wording so leadership does not overread a non-issue. Nora had changed the wording because she was 26, newly promoted, and still learning which kinds of courage cost rent, health insurance, and career references. She told herself Mason had seen more than she had. She told herself senior engineers understood thresholds better. She told herself the red had been faint. That morning, when Claire asked whether the design was ready, Nora did not speak. Across the table, Mason smiled with the professional ease of a man who had already converted risk into vocabulary. He was not sweating. He was not nervous. That made the lie stronger. Mason did not think of it as a lie. He thought of it as leadership, as protecting the team from delay, as preventing an unnecessary review from shaking Northbridge's confidence. The contract had to close. The board had to see movement. Claire had to believe her head engineer had control. So he had taken a warning and made it quiet enough to survive the morning. In the lab, Ethan stared at the closed comment trail and understood the shape of the room before the room returned to him. Nora had seen something. Mason had buried it. Claire had trusted the version that reached her. And now a man in a gray work shirt was standing between all of them and the moment the design would tell the truth in front of Northbridge Aerospace. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Lily's name appeared on the cracked screen, because the early care program had called the hallway phone and told her school was ready for drop-off now. Ethan answered softly. I am almost done, sweetheart. Through the glass, he saw her lift her blue pencil in a small wave from the bench. He looked back at the screen. If he walked away, he kept his job for one more day and let the file go where everyone important wanted it to go. If he touched the layer, he would become the easiest person in the building to blame. Ethan set the phone down, picked up the pencil, and redrew the support angle on the scrap paper. The design had not become dangerous because no one saw the warning. It had become dangerous because someone decided the warning should not be loud enough to matter. Ethan did not change the base file. That mattered to him more than anyone in the building would understand at first. He had lived through one failure review where a man with the right title had turned a technical truth into a convenient accusation, and he would not give Mason Reed the gift of a messy record. The original design stayed untouched. Ethan opened a new correction layer, named it with the automatic timestamp the system gave him, and began marking the load path the way it should have been carried from the beginning. His movements were calm, but his breathing had slowed into the careful rhythm of a man stepping onto a bridge he knew might not hold. He adjusted the support angle by 2 degrees, widened the load transfer across the inner cooling channel, and added a relief curve where the heat expansion had been collecting like water behind a blocked drain. The changes looked small on the screen. Almost insulting, if a person believed size and importance had to match. A thin line here. A corrected arc there. One support web carrying force where the old design had asked the wrong part to pretend it was stronger than it was. But Ethan knew engineering did not always fail in large gestures. It failed in assumptions. He added a note in plain language, not polished, not defensive. Original model shows repeatable thermal drift at cycle 14. Recommend comparison simulation before client demo. Correction layer preserves base geometry for review. He read it once, then left it alone. Outside the lab, Lily stood from the hallway bench and pressed the sketchbook against the glass. She had drawn a plane with wings too wide for its body and a row of little blue circles along the edge. Ethan looked at her, and she smiled because she thought he was almost finished. His phone vibrated again. The school office. He let it ring out, then picked it up only after the second call. "This is Ethan Walker," he said quietly. The voice on the other end told him early care was open now, but the late drop-off window would close in 20 minutes. He looked at the clock. Northbridge would arrive in less than 40. Claire Bennett's executive team would come through those doors before that. Mason would see the layer. Mason would know instantly that someone had found a buried warning. There was still time to close the screen, replace the filter, take Lily to school, and pretend the bend in the stress path belonged to people with better titles. He thought of the 400 employees Claire was trying to protect without knowing what had been hidden from her. He thought of Nora Ellis folding her hands too tightly in the conference room. He thought of Lily watching him carry broken fans, broken lamps, broken promises from one week to the next and making them work because that was what fathers did when there was no one else to do it. Then he saved the correction layer. Not over the base file. Beside it. Clear enough to be seen. Clean enough to be tested. Honest enough that no one could say later he had tried to hide his hand. The workstation logged his badge because the maintenance access had allowed him into the lab, not because it should have allowed him into the file. That detail would hurt him. He knew at the moment the confirmation appeared. Ethan took the scrap paper, folded it once, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. He put the old filter on the maintenance cart, installed the replacement, tightened the frame, and wiped the dust from his hands with a shop towel. Nothing in the lab looked dramatic. No alarm. No flashing warning. No sound except the soft hum of air moving through the vent he had just fixed. Lily opened the hallway door a crack when he came out. "Can we go now?" she asked. Ethan looked back at the central screen through the glass. The orange correction line rested across the blue model like a truth too small for the room to respect. "Yet. In a minute," he said. "I need to make sure something does not get missed." She nodded because she trusted him, and that trust made the choice heavier. Ethan walked back into the lab and placed the scrap sketch beside the keyboard where even a room determined to misunderstand him would have to look at it first. Claire Bennett returned to the glass design lab at 7:42 with the morning arranged behind her like a machine that had no room for error. Mason Reed came in half a step behind her, carrying the confidence of a man who believed the room would always accept his version first. Nora Ellis followed with her laptop held against her chest, quieter than usual, her eyes moving to the central screen before anyone spoke. Two senior engineers entered after her, then a compliance lead, then Claire's assistant with the Northbridge arrival schedule open on a tablet. The lab changed as they came in. The empty blue glow of the early morning became a room full of authority, pressed shirts, polished shoes, badges, tablets, and people who had spent years learning where to stand when power entered. Ethan was still near workstation 3 with the maintenance cart beside him. The new air filter was installed. The old one lay neatly on the cart. His scrap sketch sat beside the keyboard, folded open. Lily stood in the hallway beyond the glass, her sketchbook hugged to her chest, her blue pencil tucked behind one ear. Claire saw Ethan first, then the screen. Her hand tightened around the silver tablet. The correction layer was visible over the turbine cooling module, the thin orange line cutting across the clean blue model like an accusation. For 1 second, no one moved. Mason moved next. He stepped toward the workstation, looked at the layer panel, then turned sharply toward Ethan with a face that had already found its target. "This was locked last night," he said. "That layer was not there." Claire looked at Ethan. "Explain why you are still in this lab." Ethan kept his hands at his sides. "The air filter was jammed. I replaced it." "That is not what I asked." Her voice was controlled, but the control made it heavier. Ethan glanced once through the glass at Lily. She was watching him closely now, trying to understand why every adult had suddenly become still. He looked back at Claire. "I saw a repeatable drift in the thermal cycle. I left a correction layer for review." Mason gave a short, dry laugh. "You left a correction layer?" One of the senior engineers looked at the screen, then away, as if looking too long might make him responsible for seeing it. Claire set the tablet down on the conference table. It landed flat, silver against glass, and the sound traveled through the lab. "Do you understand what unauthorized access means in this building?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand what this design represents?" "Yes." "Then you understand how reckless this is." Ethan did not answer quickly enough for her. Mason stepped in, voice smooth, almost helpful. "Claire, we need to quarantine the file, document the breach, and remove him from the lab before Northbridge arrives. If they see that a maintenance employee touched the model, confidence in the submission becomes a problem before we even start." Nora's fingers tightened around the edge of her laptop. She looked at the correction line, then at the comment trail hidden in the simulation notes, then at Mason. Ethan saw her look. Mason did too. Claire did not. She was still facing Ethan, still seeing the gray work shirt, the maintenance cart, the timing, the threat to 6 months of work. "This is not initiative," she said. "This is not helpful. This is reckless, unauthorized, and dangerous to everything this team has built." The room absorbed the words in silence. Lily's face changed behind the glass. Not dramatically. She only lowered her sketchbook a little, as if it had become too heavy to hold. That was the part Ethan felt. Not Claire's anger. Not Mason's performance. His daughter watching him be reduced to the least important version of himself in a room that had no idea who he was. He could have said he used to design systems like this. He could have said Mason's closed comment was sitting inside the file like a fingerprint. He could have said the old model would fail at cycle 14. Instead, he looked at Claire and spoke quietly. "Run the original model first." Mason's expression hardened. "Absolutely not." Claire's eyes narrowed. "You are not in a position to request anything." "No," Ethan said. "I am not." He looked at the central screen. "But the design is." No one spoke. Outside the glass, Lily stood very still with the blue pencil behind her ear. Inside the lab, Claire Bennett looked at the man she thought had crossed a line, and for the first time that morning, something about his calm made the room hesitate before finishing the mistake. Nora Ellis had spent the morning trying not to look like the only person in the room who was afraid for the right reason. She stood near the simulation console with her laptop held against her ribs, feeling the heat of every second moving toward the Northbridge arrival as if the countdown clock were no longer in the conference room but inside her chest. Mason Reed was still looking at Ethan with the hard patience of a man waiting for security to solve an inconvenience. Claire Bennett stood beside the glass table, one hand resting near the silver tablet she had set down too sharply, her eyes moving between the correction layer and the man in the gray work shirt who had asked for something he had no authority to ask. The lab stayed silent for 3 full seconds. Then Nora heard her own voice before she felt ready to use it. "Run one comparison simulation." Mason turned toward her slowly. "Nora." He said her name like a warning disguised as surprise. She swallowed, but she did not step back. "The Northbridge team is not here yet. The simulation environment is already open." If the original model holds, we lose 5 minutes and document the access issue. If it does not hold, we need to know before the demo. Mason's face remained professionally calm, but something tightened at the corner of his mouth. We are not delaying a client presentation because maintenance staff made an amateur mark on a certified model. Ethan did not look at him. He kept his attention on the central screen, where the orange correction line waited beside the blue geometry like a question the room had been trained not to ask. Claire looked at Nora for the first time with full attention. "Why are you saying this?" Nora's grip on the laptop shifted. She could have stopped there. She could have said it was just caution. She could have let the room keep believing the warning had appeared that morning with Ethan's pencil and nowhere else before. Instead, she looked at the model and chose the smaller truth first. "Because the drift he marked is in the same region I flagged during extended testing." The words moved through the lab with no sound attached to them, but everyone felt the change. One senior engineer looked at Mason. The compliance lead glanced toward the console. Claire's face did not move, yet the stillness around her sharpened. "You flagged it?" she asked. Nora nodded once. "A review note. It was closed as acceptable variance." Mason stepped closer to the table. "Because it was acceptable variance. This is exactly why junior analysts do not escalate noise into executive drama." Ethan's eyes moved briefly to Nora then back to the screen. There was no triumph in his face. Only recognition. Claire lifted one hand, and Mason stopped talking. That was the first real shift. Not the simulation. Not the correction. Claire stopping Mason mid-explanation. She looked at the countdown on the wall monitor beyond the glass door. 26 minutes until Northbridge. She looked at Lily in the hallway, small and motionless with the sketchbook pressed flat against her coat. She looked at Ethan, who had not asked anyone to believe him, only to let the design speak before people did. "Run the original model," Claire said. Mason's jaw tightened. "Claire, I strongly advise against creating an unofficial test record this close to presentation." "Then make it official," she said. "Nora, log the comparison. Base design first. Correction layer second. Full thermal cycle view on the central screen." Nora moved before fear could catch her again. She set her laptop down, connected to the console, and began the sequence with fingers that trembled once, then steadied. The lab lights dimmed automatically around the display. The turbine cooling module enlarged on the wall, clean and blue, rotating slowly as the simulation initialized. Ethan stepped back another foot, giving the room no reason to say he was crowding the work. Mason stood very still. Claire folded her arms, but not in anger now. In waiting. Outside the glass, Lily raised one hand and placed it against the door, not touching her father but close enough for him to see. Ethan saw it. He did not smile. He only gave the smallest nod. Cycle 1 began. The model held. Cycle 2. Still blue. Cycle 3. The room breathed carefully. By cycle 7, Mason's confidence had returned just enough for him to glance at Claire as if the matter were already proving itself small. By cycle 10, one of the senior engineers shifted his weight. By cycle 12, Nora leaned closer to the screen. Cycle 13 passed with only a faint orange pulse at the inner channel. Mason opened his mouth. Then cycle 14 started, and the line bent exactly where Ethan had drawn it. Cycle 14 did not fail loudly. It failed with the quiet cruelty of proof. The blue stress map held for one more second, then a red seam opened along the inner cooling channel exactly where Ethan's pencil line had predicted it would. It was narrow at first, almost delicate, a thin warning across a shape that had looked perfect 10 seconds earlier. Then the thermal load shifted into the support web, the tolerance marker dropped below safe range, and the simulation froze the failure point on the central screen. No alarm was needed. No dramatic sound had to fill the lab. The room understood the color. Nora's hand stopped above the keyboard. One senior engineer leaned forward and did not speak. The compliance lead lowered his tablet slowly, as if making less movement might make the image less true. Mason Reed stared at the screen with the expression of a man watching language abandon him. Claire Bennett did not move at all. Her hand rested flat on the edge of the glass table, fingers spread, silver tablet untouched beside her. For 6 months, she had defended that design. For 6 months, she had trusted reports, signatures, summaries, and Mason's calm explanations. Now the original model sat in front of her with a red failure line burning through every clean sentence she had been given. She looked at the cycle count in the corner of the display. 14. Then she looked at Ethan. He was standing a few feet back from the workstation, hands at his sides, face still, not relieved, not proud, not waiting to be congratulated. That was almost worse. If he had smiled, she could have hated the moment more easily. If he had looked satisfied, she could have made the room about his attitude instead of her mistake. But he gave her nothing except the same quiet precision he had brought into the room before anyone believed him. Mason cleared his throat. That result may be a simulation artifact. Nora turned toward him before she seemed to realize she had moved. It is repeatable, she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried. That is why I flagged it. Mason's eyes flicked to her. We have not confirmed environmental parameters. Ethan spoke for the first time since the run began. Run the same temperature spread with the correction layer. Claire looked at him, then back at the red screen. The Northbridge delegation would be arriving in less than 20 minutes. Every instinct in the old version of the morning would have told her to stop, contain, document, and protect the room from looking uncertain. But uncertainty had already arrived. It was standing on the screen in red. Claire nodded once. Run it. Nora reset the simulation with hands steadier than before. The original model disappeared. Ethan's correction layer came forward, still small, still plain, still nothing like the kind of answer a boardroom expected to save $50 million. A 2-degree adjustment. A widened load path. A relief curve where heat had been collecting against the wrong support. Mason said nothing this time. The lab light stayed low around the central display. Outside the glass, Lily watched through the door with the sketchbook against her chest, her blue pencil still behind one ear. Ethan did not turn toward her. He kept his eyes on the model. Cycle 1 began. Blue. Cycle 2. Blue. Cycle 6. Stable. Cycle 10. The stress map shifted, but it did not bend wrong. Cycle 13 arrived, passed, and left the inner channel intact. No one breathed loudly. Cycle 14 began. The room waited for the red seam. It did not come. The load spread across the corrected support path and held. Cycle 15. Blue. Cycle 16. Blue. The screen settled into green validation markers along the channel Ethan had redrawn on scrap paper less than an hour earlier. No one applauded. They were too busy understanding what they had almost lost. Claire set both hands on the table now, not to steady the glass, but herself. Mason looked smaller without moving. Nora exhaled once, barely audible. Ethan finally looked through the glass at Lily. She lifted the sketchbook a little, uncertain but proud in the careful way children are when they sense the room has changed without knowing all the reasons why. Then the lab doors opened at the far end, and Claire's assistant stepped in with the Northbridge visitors behind her. The representatives saw the green screen first, then the silent engineers, then the man in the gray work shirt standing apart from everyone else. Claire did not explain immediately. She looked at the corrected model, then at Ethan, and for the first time that morning, she saw past the uniform.